Rock God is Stone Cold. The Hellraiser is back.
Here we go. Evolution of the Shield.
John Cena versus the Showstopper.
Hulk Hogan and The Rock in the same ring.
You will never take my place at the head of the table.
Undertaker with a Hell's Gate submission. Oh my God! What?
My God, Michaels just kicked Cena's head off.
The Monday Night Wars have come to WrestleMania.
It'll be The Rock. It'll be Austin one-on-one.
Third and five to the Undertaker.
Do you believe in miracles?
The streak is over.
Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome back to Rivalries on the WWE podcast on this Friday, December 10th, as I'm wishing all of you guys out there happy holidays, whether it be Merry Christmas to you or Happy Hanukkah or whatever you're celebrating at this time of year. I hope you're all doing well, as hopefully we all get to experience more of a normal type of Christmas as opposed to last year. I know I'm looking forward to it. And one of the rare months in the WWE world where we will not have a pay-per-view. I know I touched on that last week, but I actually think it is a good breath of fresh air, as I'm sure I've mentioned in past weeks. I think the TLC pay-per-view had unofficially become the least anticipated pay-per-view of the year in recent weeks, or recent years rather. And I mean, I believe it took over for Armageddon, which had traditionally been the December pay-per-view in the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression era. So it's nice to see WWE, kind of call an audible a bit and go with the new day one pay-per-view, which seems kind of like a reinvigorated version of New Year's resolution. Fun fact, that is the pay-per-view where Edge cashed in the first ever Money in the Bank contract. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about rivalries, and I think this is a pretty cool rivalry that we are going to cover today. And we are going back to 2006 for Mickie James versus Trish Stratus. And, thinking back on this rivalry, and I got the idea for this rivalry through the Ruthless Aggression series, where they covered the first women's revolution that happened in the Ruthless Aggression era. And while I think you could use that term extremely, extremely loosely in regards to the women in the Ruthless Aggression era, they did, for the first time ever, seem to have rivalries and matches and storylines that went way beyond just shallow, looks-based type of programs, in my opinion. And the Mickie James versus Trish Stratus rivalry, for me, was the most in-depth rivalry they had gone in the women's division at that point in WWE. And honestly, even nowadays, you could make the case that in terms of how in-depth and intricate they went with that rivalry and storyline, you could make the case it still stands as a top 5, if not top 10 rivalry in the history of the women's division. Now, all the other things that came around with it that we'll certainly get to, that certainly would not fly in the current WWE or social landscape across the world in terms of sexuality and all that, that's besides the point. But WWE investing this much time and effort to really put over a newcomer and nobody in Mickie James, and just really put this women's match and storyline on, I would say, anything other than the back burner for the first time in a long time. And going back to this point, 2006, we didn't know it then, but Trish Stratus's career was winding down faster than we knew, and she would ultimately retire in the fall of 2006. But Trish Stratus had been on quite a run in WWE to this point, and was kind of like the unofficial face of women's wrestling. And, you could throw Lita into that mix as well, but Trish was just on a different level, because unlike Lita, Trish had always been like blazing her own trail for the most part. Obviously, she had the whole angle with Vince McMahon in late 2000, early 2001. Before that, she was kind of the valet for Albert and Test as their tag team, TNA. I guess you guys could figure that one out pretty seriously, or pretty easily rather. But by the time the Ruthless Aggression era kicked in late 2002, early 2003, Trish was kind of like her own woman. And from 2002 to 2006, Trish Stratus was involved in the Women's Championship match at WrestleMania 4 out of 5 times. The only match that she wasn't involved in was Victoria versus Molly Holly in the hair versus hair match. And even at that WrestleMania, Trish played a pretty big role in it because she turned heel on Chris Jericho, aligning herself with Christian and helping the latter get the victory over Chris Jericho. So Trish was really almost like an untouchable. And it was always kind of like that argument of Trish versus Lita, kind of like Rock versus Austin in this era of WWE. But Trish was just something on a completely different level. She was women's champion a lot more. And like I said, aside from the Vince McMahon alignment and the manager to Test and Albert earlier on in her career, and I think even Val Venus at one point, she really jumped out on her own. As opposed to Lita, who she was part of Team Extreme, kind of was in the background with the Hardy Boys. And then even when she turned babyface and kind of became more of a singles competitor, she had the whole program with Kane, then eventually turns heel and aligns herself with Edge. It always just seemed like Lita was attached to somebody more times than not, as opposed to Trish was on her own more times than not, and in women's championship matches at WrestleMania and all that. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't know if Lita was ever involved in a women's championship match at a WrestleMania. I would have to go back and look on that. Maybe at WrestleMania 18. That may have been it, but I would have to double check. So by the time of late 2005, you kind of have Trish, again, rightfully on her throne. At this point, Lita is the kind of, she's aligned with Edge, as he is on his meteoric rise, getting that massive push, as I just mentioned, with the Money in the Bank briefcase. And Trish was kind of running out of competitors. She had a long storied rivalry with Lita, as I just mentioned. She also had a very under-the-radar program with Victoria. On a side note, she's one of my favorite women's competitors of all time. I thought Victoria was a very underrated heel and also had a decent run as a babyface heading into WrestleMania 20. But it was clear that Trish was losing legitimate competitors to go up against. You know, the prior WrestleMania, she goes up against Christy Hemme for the Women's Championship, who was the first ever Diva Search winner in WWE. She won that in 2004, and she was kind of managed by an injured Lita to try and make up for that lack of star power. But Christy Hemme never really amounted to anything much in WWE, and the match was kind of indicative of that. Trish versus Christy Hemme at WrestleMania 21 really did feel like a throwaway match. And then by 2005, you have Ashley, who was a newcomer, who came in through the Diva Search as well, the second year that they explored this avenue. And I believe Ashley did win the Diva Search. And she had kind of been getting aligned with Trish Stratus, getting the rub from Trish Stratus. But in late December of 2005, or late 2005 in general, we got an unexpected debut from a woman that nobody had ever seen before.
Amazing that these women, as I mentioned, know each other so well.
And Victoria, right in the lower back of Trish. Victoria tried to exploit Trish's back condition. Hey. Look,
We got company!
there's Ashley.
Look at Ashley!
The 2005 Diva Search winner, Ashley.
She got a chokehold on you. Whoa. Hey, see, Ashley, she tends to get in a little bit over her head sometimes.
Man, that was a punt. That was a punt.
Ashley is down. Hey!
What the hell's that?
What was that? Was it out of the crowd? Can we get some security, please?
Why is this woman beating up Victoria? And gosh, she knows how to throw a right hand and a thrust kick that takes Victoria to the floor.
Whoever that is, I think learned to slap from Stephanie McMahon earlier tonight.
Oh, man. And whoever this lady is using that women's title belt to take Victoria off the apron, and now with a smile on her face, handing it back to Trish.
Whoever she is, I like what she's not wearing.
Trish is as confused as to who this lady is as we are.
I have absolutely no idea.
So an unknown Mickie James comes out to make the save after a failed attempt by Ashley to help out Trish Stratus. And this is kind of what made it an interesting angle, because you had Ashley, who was in fact the 2005 Diva Search winner, seemingly put in a place to get the rub from Trish Stratus to, move her onto a track that would get her to the main event eventually. Because I'm sure that on some level, WWE knew that Trish did not have that much time left. Effectively, from this point on, in October of 2005, she would only be in WWE for just over one more calendar year. And Lita was not far behind her. So I'm sure that on some level, McMahon and the rest of creative knew that their two biggest stars in the women's division were winding down their respective careers. So at this point, you're trying to find successors to them to be the faces of this division. And it seemed like Ashley was going to be that person. But you get this debut of Mickie James, and she gets thrusted into this triangle, and they quickly start a kind of single white female type of storyline. And I was only 11 years old at this time, but I was familiar with that movie, and I remember saying, like, oh my god, they're literally doing an angle that is pretty darn similar to a single white female. And it turned out that Mickie James was a super fan, and that she was not in love with Trish Stratus, or we'll actually get to that, but she was just an uber super fan of Trish Stratus. At this point, you kind of had this depth and this intricate storyline that we were not accustomed to in WWE's women division, because it always seemed like they were just kind of in the background. You had the stars like Trish, like Lita, kind of Victoria as well, but in terms of intricate and complicated storylines, we never really saw that as far as the women division went. But then we get, a costume competition where Mickie James comes out dressed like Trish Stratus in her gear, wearing a blonde wig, with a paper-made women's championship. Trish comes out, and over time you started to see cracks in the Trish and Mickie James relationship. And to do it justice was kind of when it boiled over around the holidays, Monday Night Raw on Boxing Day, when Mickie James and Trish Stratus bumped into each other in the women's locker room.
Oh, ta-da! Trish! Ah! Merry Christmas! Oh, Merry Christmas! Wow, do you like it?
Yeah, it's very
festive. We didn't get to spend Christmas together because, we had to go home and spend it with our family, so...
Right.
I figured, why not spread a little holiday cheer?
Right, and you did. Everywhere. It's nice.
Thanks. Do you like it?
Yeah.
You like it? I mean, I know that your Christmas present to me is when I get to wrestle you for the Women's Championship at New Year's Revolution. I mean, just think about it. It's you versus me, the greatest women's champion of all time.
Yeah, you versus me.
Yeah.
In the ring for my women's championship.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Isn't that exciting?
You realize what the championship title means to me, right?
Of course, Trish. I mean, seriously.
And I'll do everything.
I know, but Trish. Look up. Do you know what that is? It's the mistletoe. You know what that means, right?
Mickie.
Trish, what? I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Oh my God. Please don't.
You know what?
I'm so stupid.
I gotta go.
I didn't mean it. Trish, don't go.
So you have Trish Stratus pretty much get freaked out like any normal person would in this circumstance after Mickie James kisses her on the lips under a mistletoe. And this is when you kind of started to realize that this rivalry was one that had never really seen before. And at this point, you're 2.5 months into this Mickie James experiment, and it was catching on because, again, it was something so incredibly different from what any of us had seen as far as women's wrestling had gone through. And obviously, there is kind of the unfortunate sexualized aspect of this. Like, I'm not going to deny it. That kind of puts a damper on this program as a whole. But I mean, it was a product of its time. The sexuality or sexualization of women was unfortunately a very big part of WWE and pro wrestling back then. But, Mickie James although she had that incorporated in this angle, and definitely WWE, almost to a fault, had this going on in this storyline, it was still a very good rivalry and an absolute brilliant type of example of good storytelling that we were not accustomed to with women's wrestling. Like, I don't think we had ever seen long-term booking in this kind of fashion in WWE at any point. Like, of course you had the Lita, Trish, on and off, you know, friends, not friends, tagging opponents for, I would say, the better part of 5 years to this point. But even that was just kind of like, not that it was manufactured, but it was just like, these are the two women who are the most over with the fans, and they are default, you know, opponents. As opposed to this is that you took a nobody, plucked her out of nowhere, Mickie James, and dropped her into a program and a storyline with arguably the most popular and superior women's wrestler in the history of the industry, and it starts working. And obviously they have a match at New Year's Revolution. Trish Stratus successfully defends the women's championship, and you would think that maybe this was the payoff. Like, hey, they got a good run. Mickie James got the rub from Trish Stratus. You know, she loses in a hard-fought effort against her at New Year's Revolution. And then you can go on, you know, on a different path. Because that was kind of what the women's division was at that time. It was on to the next thing, on to the next thing. What can you do? Sexualize this, that, and the other thing. But the thing is that they kept going. And to be honest, for good reason. Because they had finally found a storyline and a program on the women's side that fans had continual interest in. And even Trish Stratus, like, at this point, the character was starting to get stale a bit. People knew what you're getting with Trish Stratus. They had tried her as a heel. She was back to babyface, back to heel, back to babyface. They had done it all. You know, she had had a drawn out rivalry with Victoria. Lita was off, kind of stapled to Edge at this point. And Ashley, you know, unfortunately, she was a very vanilla character. And as we all know, she did not amount to much in WWE. But Ashley was a big part of this angle, which made it work even better. And eventually, how this kind of started to boil over was when Ashley really started to voice her displeasure for Mickie James and calling her a psycho, and she's crazy, and she's this, and she's that. And it ultimately leads to a match between Mickie James and Ashley at the Royal Rumble with Trish Stratus as the special guest referee. And then even beyond that, we start to get the crazier and crazier side of Mickie James start to creep out here. And it really kind of came to an absolute head when Mickie James had a present for Trish Stratus.
Trish, you don't want to come out? I mean, how about I give you a little sneak peek of what's inside? How's that?
Uh-oh.
Come on, open the box.
Let's see Mickey's box here. What is that?
What's this?
What the hell is that?
What do we got here?
Something moving. All right, well, here comes the women's champion, Trish Stratus.
Trish, you know they say curiosity killed the cat.
Don't stay right there. I'll punch your face
Ashley.
in, Trish. I swear to God I will. Get down. Get down.
Wow, got Ashley tied up.
What's the matter? Oh, God, you look all angry. What are you so mad for?
Ashley's got a broken leg.
Get down, Trish. We know Ashley, don't we? Your best friend, Ashley? You know, Ashley called me a psycho. Do you think I'm psycho now, Ashley? Huh?
I think one could make that argument.
You know what? Better yet, Trish, I think I'll just keep Ashley, little old Ashley, for myself. What? You don't want to help her? She's your friend, right? You don't want to help her? What?
Look out, look out!
Well, finally, Trish has got a hold of Mickie James.
Come on, Trish. There you go.
And Trish doesn't want to wait till WrestleMania. She wants a piece of this psychopath Mickie James right now.
Well, Mickie James has wanted to get her hands on Trish for a long time, but not that way.
Well, Trish better pay attention. You knew Mickie wasn't going to be down for very long. And
I gotta agree with you two. I think she is a psycho. This is as far as she.
That is putting it mildly.
Mickie has never gone this far.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh, my God.
Mickie's bleeding from the nose. Trish can't move. Ashley's tied up.
Guys, this is scary. This is scary.
And Mickie is loving every minute of
She's
this.
slamming again.
Every second of this.
You love me now, Trish Stratus! Ah!
Oh, my God.
So, Mickie James, yeah, she was so damn good. Honestly, she was a very, very good heel at this time. And a woman's heel that I don't think we had ever seen to that point. And the fact that she had bursted onto the scene in October of 2005 and she was booked in the Women's Championship match at WrestleMania just a short, 4 or 5 months later, tells you all you need to know about how good she was in this role. And she got this ball and she ran with it. And she took it right to the end zone and really kind of won over the fans. Although she was the heel, a lot of fans got behind her. And to this day, Mickie James is probably in my top 3 for women's wrestlers of all time, just because of how big of an impact she made right off the bat in her WWE career. And, for her to have Ashley tied up and then take out Trish Stratus while Ashley's tied up in a chair, and then she's bleeding from the nose after the early onslaught by Trish, and then she kisses her and the blood goes onto Trish's face and all that. The visual was, it made your skin crawl because it felt so almost not realistic, but it felt like a really kind of relatable storyline. Obviously, I'm not a woman, I can't directly relate to it, but it feels like something bleeped up that you would figure would happen on some level in real life. And obviously it was drawn and based heavily off of the film Single White Female, which was almost identical and ran parallel with this. But it just made a ton of sense here to push Mickie James as they were. And like I said, this was a women's division that had become incredibly stale, and even with Trish Stratus, as over as she was and as popular as she was, and she had good storylines and good rivalries to date, it was a big boost and almost like a rejuvenated version of her and a new wrinkle to her character and the angles that she had been involved in to have someone like Mickie James. And there was one moment and one segment on Monday Night Raw ahead of their match at WrestleMania 26 or WrestleMania 22, it was in 2006, that really kind of put Mickie James on a whole different level. And she cut this promo backstage almost sitting in a collage to Trish Stratus with candles, really messed up scene. And what she said really kind of set this tone for their contest on the grandest stage of them all.
Trish, I've admired you for so long. But now, this Sunday at WrestleMania, my obsession is not just going to be to beat you and to become the new women's champion. No. My new obsession is your destruction.
Well, I mean, there's just not enough you could say about Mickie James, in my opinion. And it's not just my opinion, because by the time it got to WrestleMania 22, the fans were behind her. And that was a crowd in, I believe it was Chicago, that really kind of set the tone for a new era in wrestling. And as my memory serves me, as long as it serves me correctly, of course, is that this was the dawn of the era where fans really started speaking out against, you know, the corporate choices and the presented baby faces. And, you know, you had John Cena get booed out of the building in favor of Triple H on this pay-per-view. And this particular match, you had Mickie James getting overwhelmingly cheered in favor of Trish Stratus, which had become kind of like the staple and top babyface of the women's division, and had been there for the majority of the 5 years leading up to this match. And, you know, it was funny because you could tell that WWE was not used to this, and I think this was kind of like the dawn of the internet era. And, you know, in 2006, that's when the internet really started becoming a big thing. I believe Facebook had just gotten off the ground, and you had, you know, other early on social media platforms that really started making headway in the late 2000s. And I think that was a big kind of catalyst for fans, you know, cheering for the heel or rejecting the corporate baby faces. And we saw that in 2006. And one of the big examples of that was Mickie James versus Trish. And I remember in the match, you had JR kind of like acknowledging, like, oh, well, you know, what was the term he used? He said a lot of the fans here must have gotten hallway passes from the asylum, kind of saying just like all these crazy people are cheering for this psychotic Mickie James. And this match was a really good match. And again, it felt like the most important women's match, arguably in the history of WrestleMania, in my opinion. I'm sure someone else will come at me with something better, but until 2006, I don't know if there had been a better match built to a WrestleMania in the women's division. Because let's just take a quick history of, and I'll just list the women's matches that I witnessed in my lifetime. 21, you had Trish versus Christy Hemme, which was really a bad flop, and Christy Hemme really never got over with the crowd. Then at 20, you had Victoria versus Molly Holly, which was a hair versus championship match, and I think they added that stipulation to get some people even interested in the contest. At WrestleMania 19, you had Jazz versus Trish versus Victoria. You know, a triple threat match didn't feel all that more important. It was just kind of piggybacking off of the Trish and Victoria rivalry, and then threw a beast like Jazz in there, like a very big hard hitter in the women's division. At WrestleMania 18, there was another triple threat match. I forget exactly who was involved, but Trish was involved in that contest. I remember because she came out in the Canadian gear because it was in Toronto. So this, and even WrestleMania 17, you had Chyna versus Ivory of the Right to Censor, which really did not have a whole lot of interest. So this, to me, at this point in time, was the best. It was the best booked and best built rivalry heading into a women's match at a WrestleMania, and it was great. And you know, obviously, we have the infamous moment of Mickie James putting her hand on, it's really tough to cover this in a PG way, but she put her hand on an area of Trish's body that she wasn't supposed to and proceeded to lick her hand with it. And you, on any WWE platform, they have removed that clip when covering the match. And apparently Mickie James got in a lot of crap backstage for doing it. Understandably so, but still in real time, it added a whole lot to the visual and to the match. And with the crowd completely behind her, I may add. And although the finish was a bit underwhelming, the fans ultimately got what they wanted.
Here now, look at this move right here. Oh, a tremendous show of strength and grit by Trish Stratus on one leg, taking down Mickie James with that head scissors. Oh, what's strange, like you said, a lot of these fans it seems like they're actually identifying with Mickie James. I don't think that these fans have showed us anything yet as far as their unpredictability is concerned. Here we are in Chicago. Most of these fans had to check with their parole officer. Last close line, takedown. Well, look out here. And Trish Stratus, who has done absolutely nothing wrong with these fans. I think, again, they're just being somewhat defiant here tonight. Maybe some can identify that Mickie James double leg pickup into a modified spine buster. Oh, the near fall
makes sense. She makes my eyeballs very happy. Oh, good grief.
Trish left her feet, became vulnerable, and Mickie able to drive both her feet into Trish's sternum. Trish took a chance and didn't pay off there. And now the hey! Look at this! Trish showing great athleticism.
Oh, wait a minute, it's getting reversed here.
Mickie James! Mickie James countered Trish Stratus, and the end may be near for the women's champion with her title on the line.
Look at this face.
Mickie James, getting combination, and Trish barely able to kick out. Mickie James.
That looked like a knockout punch.
Man, that's all.
Oh, my.
Kick right to the face. Mickie James trying to take Trish mentally right out of her game after physically trying to take that left leg away.
Took me mentally right out of my game.
And Mickie James now taking down Trish Stratus. Will it be enough? Yes, it is. WWE champion. The nut job has won the title.
Here's your winner and the new WWE Women's Champion, Mickie James.
The inmate's going to be running the asylum.
Just a great call by JR. The nut job has won the title. And you know what? It was so funny to see, or hear rather, Jim Ross trying to, justify why the fans wouldn't be cheering for Trish. Like, oh, no, there's nothing not to like about her. I like her. Or there must be something in the wine here in Chicago. But I think it was just something different. Mickie James was something different to an otherwise predominantly vanilla women's division in WWE, and that's not the women's fault. At this time, it was creative's fault, and they did not give the women the proper platform and stage to truly show how talented they are like we see today. And more often than not, women's matches feel the most important in modern day WWE. So it has nothing to do with the women at this time. And, competitors like Victoria predominantly, Molly Holly, like these women would have been remembered so much more fondly had they been given the same opportunity as women like Bayley and Sasha Banks and Rhea Ripley and Charlotte and Bianca Belair and Becky Lynch, of course. But unfortunately, more times than not, it was always just very shallow storytelling and creative from the people running WWE at the time. But this was a program that I think really was a sight for sore eyes, because you had a very in-depth rivalry. You had something that was beyond like looks and the sexualization and this and that. And that's not to say that wasn't included in this rivalry, but it was kind of something in the background just to enhance it. There was so much more depth into it. And the other thing is, they created a star with Mickie James. Unfortunately, I think she peaked in the wrong time in WWE, because although the women's division went up for a bit in the later part of the Ruthless Aggression era, it absolutely plummeted in the PG era, when the Divas era with the Divas Championship, the Butterfly title. I think, unfortunately for Mickie James, she kind of peaked in that time. And, when she came back, I think they could have done more with her when she was Alexa Bliss's sidekick and all that. But I think one of the biggest positives to take away from this is that they created a legacy star with Mickie James. And one of the coolest moments at the first ever Women's Royal Rumble, when Trish came back and she squared off with Mickie James in the Royal Rumble match. Or then even at the first women's pay-per-view, Evolution, you had Trish tagging with Lita against Mickie James, and I believe it was Alicia Fox. So, I mean, there was a lot to like about this program. In a lot of ways, I think it resulted in the most important women's match at a WrestleMania all the way until, you could probably say, WrestleMania 32, when they finally scrapped the Divas Championship and turned it back into the women's title, when you had the triple threat match between Becky, Sasha, and Charlotte. So in my opinion, up until 2016, a full decade later, this stood as the most important and best built women's championship match in the history of WrestleMania. Obviously, since 2016, with the Revolution, with Charlotte and Bianca and Becky doing what they're doing, Sasha as well, this has just really been kind of left in the dust, and rightfully so. But it still does not change the fact that this rivalry and match and build and everything about it stood the test of time as one of the best women's programs in the history of the business, at least until the mid 2010s, let's say. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed Mickie James versus Trish Stratus. As always, you can get me on Twitter at ADeMarco25. You can get Matt on Twitter at Real WWE Podcast, or sorry, at Wrestling_audio, and you can email him at realwwepodcast@gmail.com. Anyway, guys, I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening to the WWE Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a show, or head to WWEpodcast.com. And for all of these shows ad-free, head over to patreon.com/WWE Podcast. Until then, we'll see you next time.